Chilcot says Blair was determined to go to war before exhausting the peaceful options. The then Prime Minister had told President Bush, "I'm with you, whatever." But the dodgy dossier intelligence and legal justifications for war were weak. Poor equipment and planning left British forces vulnerable.
The UK chose to join the invasion of Iraq before the peaceful options for disarmament had been exhausted. Military action at that time was not a last resort.
Tony Blair is due to speak in the next few minutes. He said he took his decision to go to war in good faith and hoped the report would put an end to charges of bad faith, lies and deceit. We'll have reaction from the families of those who were killed in the conflict. After a 7-year wait here at Westminster today, Sir John Chilcot delivered his findings on the decision that took Britain to war with Iraq 13 years ago. I'm live with the very latest on the report's findings and the reaction to it. Also this lunchtime. 6 years behind bars for Oscar Pistorius for murdering his girlfriend. And a moment in history for Welsh fans as their team goes for glory in tonight's Euro 2016 semi-final.
This is the ITV Lunchtime News with Alistair Stewart in Westminster.
Good afternoon from Westminster. After 7 years, the long-awaited report into the Iraq War, ironically compared in length with War and Peace, was published here this morning. It concludes that the threat to the United Kingdom from Iraq was exaggerated, that former Prime Minister Tony Blair had pledged his support to George Bush and war, whatever happened. The report, as you can see, is mammoth, more than 2.5 million words. In that document, Sir John Chilcot was scathing on the decision to go to war, its conduct and the aftermath. Here are some of the report's key points. The UK government's decision to invade Iraq was made before the peaceful options for disarmament had been exhausted. That decision was based on untested and false intelligence. The legal basis for UK military action was far from satisfactory. Mr. Blair argued his case for war with a certainty that was not justified. The Ministry of Defence was criticised for being slow to respond to gaps in resources needed by troops, meaning that the army had to resort to making humiliating deals with enemy militias because they were seriously ill-equipped. Our political correspondent Libby Vina has our top story this lunchtime.
A war mired in controversy, which cost thousands of lives, mainly Iraqi civilians, but also scores of British soldiers. Now it seems it need never have happened. They died in vain. Tony Blair looked ashen-faced as he left home this morning, and not without reason. Sir John Chilcot's report is damning.
We have concluded that the UK chose to join the invasion of Iraq before the peaceful options for disarmament had been exhausted. Military action at that time was not a last resort. We have also concluded that the judgments about the severity of the threat posed by Iraq's weapons of mass destruction, WMD, were presented with a certainty that was not justified. Despite explicit warnings, the consequences of the invasion were underestimated. The planning and preparations for Iraq after Saddam Hussein were wholly inadequate.
But what about accusations that after meeting President Bush nearly a year before the conflict, Tony Blair had committed Britain to war? It seems he did so.
On July the 28th, Mr. Blair wrote to President Bush with an assurance that he would be with him whatever.
Mr. Blair's diplomatic efforts to get UN support for the war are also heavily criticised.
In the absence of a majority in support of military action, we consider that the UK was, in fact, undermining the Security Council's authority.
The circumstances in which it was decided the war was legal, on this man, Lord Goldsmith's advice, were far from satisfactory, although this morning he was still saying it was sound.
Was the war legal?
Yes, of course it was.
The war was legal.
The Cabinet was kept in the dark about many decisions, and critically, there was never any real evidence that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction.
It is now clear that policy on Iraq was made on the basis of flawed intelligence and assessments. They were not challenged, and they should have been. Military action in Iraq might have been necessary at some point, but in March 2003, there was no imminent threat from Saddam Hussein.
For the families of British soldiers who died in the war, the conclusions were devastating.
Anger, that healing, that 11 and a half years I've worked for. I've gone back to that time when I learned that my brother had been killed. And there is one terrorist in this world that the world needs to be aware of, and his name is Tony Blair, the world's worst terrorist.
When I look at Iraq on my ITV screens today, the 200 plus deaths that took place the other day, I can only conclude that unfortunately and sadly my son died in vain.
In the Commons, the Prime Minister said there were lessons the government must learn.
Taking the country to war should always be a last resort and should only be done if all credible alternatives have been exhausted. Mr. Speaker, sending our brave troops onto the battlefield without the right equipment was unacceptable, and whatever else we learn from this conflict, we must all pledge this will never happen again.
The House was misled in the run-up to the war, and the House must now decide how it should deal with it 13 years later. Just as all those who took the decisions laid bare in the Chilcot report must face up to the consequences of their actions, whatever they may be.
But in a statement, Tony Blair said the report should later rest allegations of bad faith, lies or deceit. Whether people agree or disagree with my decision to take military action against Saddam Hussein, I took it in good faith and in what I believe to be the best interests of the country.
Tony Blair, war criminal!
Protesters such as those gathered outside the inquiry today see his actions in a very different light. And for many around the country, the Chilcot report will cast a long shadow over Tony Blair's reputation and that of Britain. Libby Vina, ITV News, Westminster.
Alistair Campbell was Tony Blair's Director of Communications and Strategy up to the beginning of the Iraq War in 2003. He was involved in the drafting of 2 Downing Street dossiers on the war, on the possibility of Saddam Hussein having access to weapons of mass destruction. And he joins us live now from Barcelona in Spain. Mr. Campbell, good of you to join us. Chilcot says Tony Blair to George Bush, quotes, "I will be with you whatever, but now is the time to assess bluntly the difficulties." Do you accept that that simply wasn't done, and it wasn't done fatally?
I think what Tony Blair was trying to do, and as Sir John recognises has some success in doing, was trying to shape American policy, try to get them to go down the UN route, which they did. Now, there came a point on the diplomatic process, and Sir John's perfectly entitled to make the judgment he does, that the diplomatic process could have continued, but there came a point on Resolution 1441 where it was perfectly clear that France and Russia in particular were not going to see through the logic of that resolution, and therefore military action followed. And the reality is Saddam Hussein did have, or he could have responded at any time to those resolutions, and it was perfectly clear, as the report recognises, after 9/11, what many witnesses to the inquiry call the calculus of threat had changed. Now, Sir John's report
But on that particular point, Alistair, on that particular point, you know that he said flawed intelligence and assessments were not challenged. The dossier was presented with a certainty that was not justified.
Yes, but we've had to deal for the last many years with these allegations of falsifying intelligence, of lying about it, of deceit, and I do think it's important that we at least recognise that that should, as Tony Blair has said, be laid to rest. Now, the intelligence reports...
But Chilcot does not say that, Alistair. Chilcot specifically says the evidence is there that those pieces of evidence were not adequately tested, not taken to Cabinet, not properly put to the test.
No, I'm sorry, Alistair. What the dossier that you're talking about, based upon intelligence that Tony Blair was seeing and other ministers were seeing, set out in that report, which, let me remind you, at the time, most of the media said there wasn't much new in it and became as controversial as it's become afterwards. Sir John Chilcot has criticised the intelligence. Tony Blair has accepted before that the intelligence is flawed. But if he's the Prime Minister and he's being shown intelligence which is making him more, not less concerned about a threat that he felt
so finally,
9/11
then, I got
made
that
greater
point.
and made more pressing.
To go back to Chilcot then specifically, is Tony Blair's failing here then that he didn't challenge the Joint Intelligence Committee? Chilcot says those bits of data, bits of intelligence should have been rigorously challenged by your former boss, and they weren't.
Well, I do think it was interesting to hear David Cameron speaking in the Commons. I just heard his statement before I came out to talk to you. And I think he was making the point that our military, our intelligence services, they are hugely respected around the world. And I think you'll see from Tony Blair when he does his statement later today, he will not evade responsibility. He will not in any way seek to pass the buck. But the reality is, if he's the Prime Minister, I think he is entitled actually to see intelligence, and he was testing it the whole time. This idea that there were no, just because they weren't all sitting around a table together, they weren't testing this the whole way through. Ultimately, Tony Blair was the only person. You can have all the committees, all the ministerial cabinet committees you want. Tony Blair was the Prime Minister who had
Alistair,
to make the
I'm going to have to interrupt you there, otherwise, ironically, we won't have time to hear what Mr. Blair himself says as well. But I'm grateful to you very much for joining us this afternoon from Spain. Alistair Campbell there, Tony Blair's former Director of Communications. Well, today's report's been 7 years in the making, and that's longer than British troops, of course, were on Iraqi soil. Chilcot inquiry was set up in 2009 by the then Prime Minister Gordon Brown. It was initially expected to take no longer than 2 years, but was delayed by what Sir John Chilcot himself described as its unprecedented scope and the time that it would take to study 150,000 documents. The inquiry has looked at how decisions were made before and during the war, what actions were taken, and what lessons can be learned. In all, 179 British service personnel were killed during the conflict between 2003 and 9. The youngest who died were 18. Their families have waited a long time for answers. Will today bring them any closer to closure or comfort? We heard a little earlier in Libby's report from Sarah O'Connor. She lost her brother Bob in 2005 when the plane he was in was shot down in Iraq. The effect of his death on her family, she says, has been nothing short of catastrophic. She's been here today and has been fighting for answers for 11 years, making it a personal mission to campaign for better military equipment. As Paul Davis now reports, she has also found some solace in writing poetry since her brother was killed.
Today is the day my hero comes home, but I feel so scared and I feel so alone.
The true cost of war, family's pain reflected in verse.
The mist is broken by an angel of metal. Together they emerge, a band of brothers, to bring home a hero to the grief-stricken mother.
Bob O'Connor was Sarah's big brother.
He was my hero. I always said he didn't need to die to become my hero.
Bob, a sergeant in the RAF, died with 9 others when their Hercules transport plane was hit by insurgents over Iraq in 2005.
The day that that plane got shot down was the day that the dynamic in our family died. It never recovered.
It was the largest single loss of life suffered by the RAF since the Second World War, made worse when the families learnt it was probably avoidable. The plane caught fire and exploded after being hit by ground fire. The coroner criticised the RAF for not fitting it with explosive repressant foam that could have saved 10 lives.
There was nothing on this planet that could have prepared me for hearing the words about the lack of explosive suppressant foam.
After saying goodbye to her brother, Sarah channeled her sorrow and growing anger into a campaign for better equipment for our armed forces.
We asked for basic care. We asked for adequate equipment. Most of the people that were in there were sent off There was no real thought process behind it. Just pick up our troops, throw them into this pit of hell, and they'll figure it out because they're British troops and they're the best.
Sarah O'Connor says Iraq has left a legacy of broken families like her own.
It doesn't just stop with like me. My children see it. My children will talk about their uncle. They will talk about how it has affected their mum. It affects them. You know, this riptide of grief, this riptide of devastation because one man had got carried away with what happened in Kosovo and thought that he could achieve the same thing with no infrastructure plan.
She has waited years for Sir John Chilcot's verdict and is quite clear what she wants from it.
I think there has to be accountability and responsibility, and when you look at the root cause of where this all came from, there is one man with blood on his hands, and that is Blair.
Sarah is with me along with her solicitor Matthew Jury. Going to quote two bits from Sir John to you. The effort never matched the scale of the challenge. UK military didn't have sufficient resources for the campaign in Iraq. Is that what you wanted to hear?
Absolutely. I've been absolutely delighted with Sir Chilcot and the Inquiry Board's findings. I feel that today justice has been awarded to those brave service personnel, their families, and our veterans of past and present, and those who are still serving, the British who helped us out there in Iraq, and the Iraqi civilians as well who helped us. And let's not forget those Iraqi that are still dying as we speak.
Alistair Campbell said Mr Blair did his very best on this programme to try and test the facts and test the preparedness. Do you accept what Mr Campbell and Mr Blair are saying?
No, absolutely. And anything that Mr Blair has said, quite frankly, is not fit for purpose. It's nothing more than a political soundbite that he's offering out to the media. But he won't come and look the families in the eye, a man who's so firm with his decision, and yet he refuses to meet with the families whose lives he's decimated.
Matthew, can I bring you in now? You've been working on this case sufficiently. There are no indictments in this report. You're a solicitor. Is there the basis for a brief to be given to a barrister for prosecution?
So the inquiry, of course, it wasn't constituted to be a court of law. It can't pass
but as you sift through
a judgment. But as we sift through the evidence, it's a very powerful report. I think it forms a solid basis for proper consideration, a full and forensic analysis, and to take the matter forward as appropriate and necessary, yes.
Is that what you want?
Absolutely. Our voice still needs to be heard, and the world needs to hear our voice, and Mr Blair needs to be stopped. And if it's us that'll do it, then let that be so.
Sarah, thank you for joining us and for spending time with Paul Davis. And Matthew, thank you also.
Thanks.
Let's pause and get some of the rest of the day's news now. And the Paralympic gold medalist Oscar Pistorius has been sentenced to 6 years in prison for murdering his girlfriend Riva Steenkamp. The disgraced athlete's original manslaughter conviction was overturned last year, and he was convicted of murder. Pistorius will have to serve half his sentence before being eligible for parole. In just a few hours' time, Wales will kick off against Portugal in the Euro 2016 semi-finals. It's the biggest match in Welsh footballing history, and a win would see the country through to a major tournament final for the first time ever. Our correspondent Emma Murphy now on the excitement of fans in Wales and in France and pretty well everywhere else.
Don't take me home.
In full voice and high spirits, Wales's travelling army are descending on Lyon. They've been allocated 6,000 of the 60,000 tickets, but are determined to snap up more or just soak up the atmosphere. It's been a very long time, but some are getting to enjoy the fun without having to wait 58 years.
Are
Wales going to win?
Yeah.
Well, it's so exciting. It's such a momentous day for us, and for the little ones to be able to come and experience it with us, it's brilliant. So we're really excited and really happy to be able to be part of it. So we just hope now for a good win. Come on, Cymru!
At the other end of the scale, retirements have been planned around this tournament.
I retired 3 days before this championship after 41 years in the NHS. And my God, what a great start to my retirement. Couldn't have been better.
Following the team for so much longer than expected has proved pricey for fans. Dan Harris has been making short films to keep those back home involved. He's had to ask anyone who likes them to donate to keep him in France.
I think the closer it gets to kick-off, the more excited, the more nervous we're going to get, and then we're going to get there, we're going to sing our hearts out, and hopefully we can spur on our boys.
And it's not just in France that they're singing. Across Wales, those fine voices are ringing out. National pride from home valleys to foreign fields. Emma Murphy, ITV News, Lyon.
And you can see Portugal take on Wales here on ITV tonight. Coverage starts from 7:15. The kickoff is at 8. Our main story this lunchtime, the findings of the Chilcot inquiry. The long-awaited report into Britain's involvement in the Iraq War has concluded that former Prime Minister Tony Blair chose to go to war before exhausting the peaceful options. The decision to take military action was based on flawed intelligence about Saddam Hussein's supposed weapons of mass destruction, and that the hastily prepared mission led to shortfalls in key equipment for British troops. A final thought from our political correspondent, Carl Dinnan. Hot foot from Mr. Blair's live speech. What did he say?
Well, he hasn't started speaking yet, but he's given a written statement saying that Chilcot has found there was no falsification or improper use of intelligence, there was no deception of cabinet, and there was no secret commitment to go to war. Now, I think once Mr. Blair is questioned about that last one, he will be asked about this famous memo written in July 2002 where he told George Bush personally, "I will be with you, whatever." A lot of people will think that amounts to a commitment to go to war fully 6 or 7 months before we did.
And finally, a brief thought. It's about how we do government as well in the future.
Yes, Chilcot has many recommendations about the way ministers were kept informed, the way Parliament was kept informed. Any government wanting to do something like this, again, will have to look at this report.
Carl, thank you very much indeed. And that is it this lunchtime on a day that a damning verdict was delivered on Britain's decision to go to war in Iraq. There'll be more reaction on the ITV Evening News on at a slightly earlier time of 6:15. And the latest on what Tony Blair has to say on our website, itv.com/news. He's due to speak, as Carl said, in the next few minutes. But for now, from all of us here at Westminster, a very good afternoon to you. Bye-bye.